Dealing with digestive symptoms can feel like you're playing the worst game of like Clue in the entire world, trying to figure out what it is that's causing them, what isn't going to cause them. But I do think in general, experimentation is really important in managing any sort of GI symptom. Most people who potentially have less ideal microbiomes than others, it's likely just because of the overall diet, potentially being higher in processed foods, lower in plant foods, and not necessarily supporting a healthy microbiome through those types of behaviors.
Welcome to Slay, the podcast where we dive into all aspects of female health, fitness, and life. I'm your host, Louise Hazel, and in today's episode, we're thrilled to have a very special guest on the show. She's an exercise and nutritional scientist studying for her PhD at Arizona State University. She's an expert in helping women to understand their unique nutritional needs and make informed decisions about their health. With years of experience in both research and practical application, she's become a trusted voice and can often be seen on Instagram debunking myths and navigating the often confusing world of diet and fitness advice. In this episode, we'll explore what every woman should know about nutrition, how to fuel your body for optimal performance and well-being, and the most common myths and misinformation that you should be avoiding. So whether you're looking to improve your diet, to enhance your training, or simply learn more about the science behind female nutrition, this conversation will provide the clarity and insights that you need. So get ready to separate fact from fiction and to discover actionable strategies to support your health and fitness goals. Please welcome Emily Dow to the show. Emily, thank you so much for joining us today. How's everything going over in Arizona?
Things are going well. They're definitely still very hot, but hopefully within the next month or so, that will chill out a little bit.
Oh, love that. Love that for you. And things will calm down. You're studying over at Arizona State. Talk to us about where you're at currently in your studies.
So I'm at a very interesting stage right now. All I have left in my doctorate is my dissertation research. And I'm in the smack dab middle of data collection right now. So I'm currently actually collecting the data for my dissertation, and then I'll be analyzing all of that in the winter/spring, and then hopefully defending and finishing by like April, May. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Can you give us an insight into what the dissertation is on?
Yeah, I would love to. It gets a little bit in the weeds pretty quickly with this, but essentially what I'm looking at is the potential impact of resistance training on the gut-brain axis. I'm very interested in relationships between the gut microbiome and the brain, and there hasn't been a ton of work on people who are resistance training.
Love that. Now, all of the data that I've seen, and I feel like you've shared some of this as well, what is all of the data kind of pointing to with regards to resistance training and brain function in particular?
Oh, it's overwhelmingly positive. I mean, a lot of the data so far has been on older adults and elderly populations, which I think is fantastic. I think hopefully some of the upcoming research is going to also look at the potential impacts in young adults, which is part of what we're looking at for my work.
Yeah.
But it's been so overwhelmingly positive when it comes to reversing cognitive decline, potentially delaying or preventing the onset of dementia, just a whole lot of potential benefits there.
Wow. Can't wait to hear the results. Definitely keep us posted on that. But today I wanted to really grill you. You're studying exercise and nutritional sciences. This is incredible. I love these two, obviously, my favorite topics. But I kind of do want to get into the weeds. I kind of wanted to get into the nitty gritty. I want to ask you all of the questions that we've been running through in the Slay Gym with our clients, all of the questions that we've kind of been answering online, people that are coming to us that in desperate need of help, because I feel like this is really an interesting time. I feel like in terms of women's health and fitness and also nutrition, we're living in this time of extreme polarity. In one sense, I don't think I've seen as many women ever in the free weights section of the gym. And so there's this huge kind of like surge of, an increase in female fitness and also an attraction to resistance training, which we probably have never really encountered before. I think there's probably more women lifting weights than there ever has been in the world right now. And on the other hand, we've got a resurgence of skinny culture. And that is taking over and, is a really, really strong narrative. I live here in Hollywood. We know it's like a microcosm. So I don't know how it's resonating across the rest of the United States, but it feels like these two things are at odds with one another. And so I kind of want to dive into a number of the common myths and misconceptions that are out there right now, that we can kind of debunk, because you've been doing a lot of this on your Instagram channel, and I absolutely love that. So we're going to dive in. I want to ask you first and foremost about a few easy topics like organic produce, for example. You spoke about this recently in your social media posts, because I think like we women, we want to put the best things in our body. But my question is organic produce really organic, or is it reliably pesticide free? What are we dealing with here? Can it be trusted?
Yeah, so the term organic, I think a lot of us are familiar with it, but we don't necessarily think too deeply about what it refers to. And essentially, the way that that is classified and regulated in the United States is not nearly as intensive as most of us would want to believe. It definitely doesn't mean pesticide free. It essentially just refers to the use of organic pesticides, many of which are derived from like natural compounds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an interesting thing, because I think most of us assume that natural always equals safer and better, but they're still effective pesticides, and we don't necessarily know if organic produce is safer than non-organic produce. We don't really have that type of data yet. So more than anything, it's kind of a marketing term, and I don't think it's bad to necessarily buy organic produce. I do think we've seen some emerging evidence on some of the potential downsides to glyphosate use, for example. And so it's potentially a safer option, but we just don't know for sure. And it's definitely a more expensive option. So if it's not something that we can all justify, I don't think that's the end of the world either.
So if you can't afford organic produce, what should you be doing to make sure that, you're not, allowing toxic chemicals or whatever into your system?
Well, I think the most important thing, first and foremost, if we're kind of focusing on the big rocks of nutrition, the sourcing of your produce, yes, it's important, but it's not nearly as important as consuming produce in the first place, which most people are not necessarily doing enough of. And it's hard. Like definitely have days where I don't consume as much produce as I would like to.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say biggest rock is just getting that in.
What do you mean by produce?
So fruits, vegetables,
Whole
in
foods?
general, yes, exactly. And so if we kind of are shifting our diets more towards whole foods, that's what I would concern myself with first before I start thinking too critically about exactly where those whole foods are coming from.
So a good step perhaps for someone who's looking to live a healthier lifestyle is like, okay, shifting towards perhaps, processed or frozen or whatever it be, through to like, daily fresh produce, fruit and vegetables, like, grown out of soil, out of plants, etc. Love that. Now,
Yeah.
Go ahead. If you wanted to say something, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off.
No, I was essentially just going to agree, because if convenience means that you're going to consume fruits and vegetables, I think that wins every day.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I wanted to ask you, I feel like, where is this obsession with organic produce coming from? Like, what is the fear that's really playing in people's minds when they're choosing that type of product?
I think the fear, a lot of that seems to come from individuals who kind of take on the mentality of like, our government is allowing us to all be sick and like dependent on it. And I understand where that sentiment comes from, because yes, we obviously have some definite political issues when it comes to our food. However, at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're being lied to about everything. And so I think that sometimes the shift towards organic everything all the time, it's easy to make that logical leap that is essential, because we can't trust our government to regulate our pesticides and everything, but we kind of forget that they're also regulating the organic classification and the organic produce just as much. I think that's part of it. And then a lot of the people kind of sending that message out into the ether also are likely a little bit more privileged, whether it comes to finances or access to organic foods. And I think unless you've been confronted with the realities of some individuals in the United States, it's very easy to assume that everyone can eat organic all the time, when
Mm-hmm.
that's just not necessarily the case.
Mm. What about the concern about, organic produce being better for our gut biome? Like, where are we at, and where are the studies with regards to the impact on gut biome and organic produce and other issues?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there were certain pesticides that were less harmful to the gut microbiome than others. Honestly, I love talking about the gut microbiome. It's my favorite thing to study, but it's so difficult to make any definite conclusions right now because we still do know so little. And I say this all the time. So people who know me are probably like, she's a broken record. But we don't necessarily know whether a change to the microbiome is good or bad when we see a change happen in certain fields of research. And even the way that we measure the gut microbiome isn't awesome right now. Most of
Mm.
it is using like stool samples, and that doesn't necessarily capture what the ecology of our actual gut looks like. It's essentially what we are disposing of through the feces. And so it's very difficult to know right now, unfortunately. But again, I think based on what we do know about the gut microbiome, consuming fresh fruits and vegetables is about one of the best things that you can do for it. So I would focus on that regardless of the potential influence of like some of these pesticides for now.
Got you. So, what are you saying, that we shouldn't be hanging all of our like chips on the idea of like improving our gut biome because the science just isn't, or at least the data just isn't yet out there?
I think it makes sense to prioritize it based on what we are pretty sure certain will benefit us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for example, like I know we're going to talk about this probably at some point. Consuming adequate fiber is a huge one.
Mm-hmm.
Most people who potentially have less ideal microbiomes than others, it's likely just because of the overall diet potentially being higher in processed foods,
Mm.
lower in plant foods, and not necessarily supporting a healthy microbiome through those types of
Mm.
behaviors.
So, what are the most important nutritional principles that all women should know about, regardless of age, fitness level, wherever they're at? What are the main things? What are the main things that they should be prioritizing?
Ooh, I would say, I mean, I primarily work with women as well, so I definitely know like the ins and outs of what most people are doing and could be doing better. I think by and large, consuming enough food on a daily basis is a huge one. I see very large fluctuations between like some days we'll eat
Mm.
absolutely nothing, and then the next day we'll eat twice as much as we normally would.
Why do you
So
think that's happening?
Probably. I mean, I think it's multifaceted for sure. I know for a lot of the folks that I work with, they're busy and it's easy to get stressed and distracted and to kind of forget to eat. I think part of it definitely has roots in like cultural assumptions that eating less is always a good thing, especially for females. And overcoming that is like it's a large hurdle, but that's something that I definitely think we need to be tackling head on.
So, if I was saying, like, give me your top three, if you were saying to every woman, what does she need to be doing out there nutritionally to make sure that she's at an optimal level every single day of the week, what would they be?
Definitely adequate protein. That's
Mm-hmm.
definitely a big one. Adequate fiber is
Mm-hmm.
probably second on that list, and potentially just consuming balanced meals regularly throughout the day. So, like 3 to 5 meals, each containing ideally a protein, a fat, a carb, and a fiber source of some kind.
Love it. So, bearing those three things in mind, let's go into those in a little bit more detail. Why might it be beneficial for me, if I'm Jane Doe off the street, to eat enough protein? What does eating enough protein even mean?
So, eating enough protein, I guess we'll start with a recommendation. Typically, we want to aim for roughly a pound or a gram per pound of body weight. That changes a little bit depending on body composition. People with a slightly higher body fat percentage can likely aim a little bit lower than that because we mostly want to be taking into account lean mass. So, using 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight can be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
That is going to, I mean, it's going to support so many of the things that we want as females, both aesthetically and in terms of just our overall health. It's incredibly important to maintain muscle mass as a female, as much as that can be controversial
Why is
in
that
terms of
important?
aesthetics. Well, females are much more likely to experience osteoporosis, osteopenia as we age. We're also more likely to experience sarcopenia, which is essentially insufficient muscle mass as we age. And those are kind of the silent killers. Those are the conditions that lead to falls, that lead to hip breaks, that lead to pneumonia in the hospital. And then just like that, if you're 75, that could be terrifying.
Mm.
So just for quality of life and longevity purposes, we definitely need muscle mass.
Got you. So one of the things that I've been experiencing in the gym recently amongst our female clients, we're always drilling home the idea of increased protein because we see so little of it in the average daily diet. Some of the, I don't want to say excuses, but I would say resistance comes in the sense of it gives me constipation. It makes me gassy. What would you say to those people who are potentially experiencing like less than favorable symptoms or outcomes as a result of, protein? And can it be linked directly to protein, or is it likely, a combination of things that are going on?
I like the way you asked that question because I was going to lead directly into where's the protein coming from. I think that's probably one of the bigger questions, and that is probably an individual response sort of thing. But I definitely find that when we seek out more protein, a lot of the time that results in protein powders, protein bars, high protein tortillas. Like we kind of tend to seek those types of products out, and those tend to have less favorable side effects when it comes to digestion for a multitude of reasons. So that's one thing. I think you also just have to kind of find sources that work well for you. For some
Mm.
people, dairy protein doesn't sit super well. For some people, animal protein in general might not sit super well. So I think a degree of experimentation is also helpful there.
Is it safe to say, and the other thing, I was having this conversation the other day, was it was like one of my clients we were talking about her nutrition that day, and she'd mentioned that she'd had lentils and all these vegetables. I was like, this sounds absolutely delicious. I'm like, where's the protein? She's like, well, I had the lentils. I was like, okay, there's 15 grams, but where's the other 100 grams? And so, we were talking about animal protein in particular. And I was trying to explain to her, if you're getting an upset stomach or if you're getting gas or whatever from chicken, try fish. There's a vast array of animal proteins to choose from. And so, like you quite rightly pointed out, especially when we're talking about like protein supplements, powders, I think there's a really interesting thing that happens is if we have a reaction to one type of protein, we kind of throw the whole category out. And actually, shouldn't we be just refining and looking for the one that actually suits and loves us back?
Absolutely. I 100% agree with that. And I get why that is sometimes frustrating because dealing with digestive symptoms can feel like you're playing the worst game of like Clue in the entire world, trying to figure out what it is that's causing them, what isn't going to cause them. But I do think in general, experimentation is really important in managing any sort of GI symptoms. And that goes for protein and fiber, honestly, because I see the same thing happen all the time there. But yes, I think rotating out different protein sources in general is a good idea. And that way you can kind of pay attention to when you feel your best versus when you don't feel as good.
Okay, so I'm asking on behalf of one of my clients who's been having some GI distress recently. What is the best way to try and pinpoint what foods are having a positive and negative effect? How would you go about that? How would you recommend to your clients pinpointing exactly what's working and what's not?
People might hate hearing me say this, but I've been here. I've had to like parse through my own weird digestive stuff in the past. I think logging symptoms is a huge one. So having some sort of record of what you ate, it doesn't have to be incredibly detailed necessarily, but at least a record of the types of foods, the ingredients potentially, and then keeping track of when your symptoms take place. I would say the trickiest part is that sometimes symptoms appear right away and sometimes they appear like the next morning. So that's kind of the tough part, but identifying patterns, I think it's important to keep things as consistent as possible for a little while. So ideally, you're kind of introducing one new variable at a time and assessing from there, kind of elimination diet style. But just keeping track of symptoms and trying to draw connections there is really going to be the best way.
Love that. And having, suffered with ulcerative colitis, I've had to kind of do the same thing. An elimination diet, never fun, but really great in finding out what your system is really kind of like loving and hating. Like it's really a really useful process. Doesn't need to necessarily even be done for a long time, would you say?
No, definitely not. And I think that's actually a common misconception is that elimination style diets should be forever diets. And that's
Mm,
definitely not the case. The idea is that you do slowly reintroduce foods so that you can assess your symptoms and what you can reincorporate.
mhm.
Because with nutrition in general, you want to be able to eat everything that you can. You don't want to be unnecessarily limiting yourself. So reintroducing is essential.
100%. I want to move on to your second point. This is the second thing you said that was like, okay, this is where women need to focus their time and attention
Yeah.
on dietary fiber. Why is fiber so important to us? Like, what are the benefits and how much should we be eating on a daily basis?
Yeah, fiber is like the unsung hero of nutrition, I feel. And I don't know if it's ever going to get sexy enough to get talked
It's
about by
just not,
everyone.
is it? It
No.
just isn't. God bless it.
I think when everyone hears fiber, they automatically think of like going to the bathroom. And that's definitely one advantage of consuming adequate fiber is just that consistency with digestion and bowel movement regularity. But that's definitely not its only purpose either. A couple of the main advantages to consuming it I think I'll just list off three because I think these are the three primary ones. First and foremost, regulating our blood sugar.
Hmm.
And that's not necessarily something anyone needs to obsess over unless they actually have concerns there. But eating carbohydrates that are either high in fiber or along with fiber sources really does help control glucose levels more effectively, especially in people who need to watch that, um, as well as regulating or reducing cholesterol values in blood lipid panels, for example. That's one of the huge advantages to a high fiber diet. It's one of the most effective strategies at reducing like LDL cholesterol, for example, is increasing fiber and paying attention to fat sourcing. And then lastly is going to probably be the most key, especially in the coming years, which is benefiting the gut microbiome because
Hmm.
fiber is essentially the food for all the beneficial bacteria in our gut.
Mm. So one of the things I was reading about actually on your Instagram page was obviously increased satisfaction as well. Like, the feeling of like feeling full after your meal and complete. And then also its positive impact on the stimulation of GLP-1, which we're finding in semaglutides, drugs like Ozempic and Wegovy. Why is that important?
Yeah, I mean, it's important to, I think when we're talking about like GLP-1 agonists and those different medications, the reason they work so well is because of the way that they affect our appetite and our satiety signaling. And so I think, even without going into a discussion on those specific medications at this point, that's key right there is that impacting appetite is favorable for weight loss and is favorable for the outcomes that we want to see with those medications. And so, if we can kind of approach satiety and appetite regulation from different perspectives, we may not necessarily need those compounds as much, especially if we're not what is typically referred to as like an ideal candidate for them. So fiber is one of those big factors that impacts satiety and allows you to feel more satisfied after a meal. Part of that is because of the blood sugar regulation as well. So that's big because if you can feel more satisfied after a meal, you're much less likely to continue overeating and kind of going down those cycles.
100%. So basically, what we're saying is there has been this kind of natural GLP-1 like agonist out there. It's called fiber. We just haven't necessarily been recognizing it for as sexy as a thing as it is. So increased protein for women, increased fiber, and then you talked about balanced nutrition. What does that look like? Talk to me specifically about macronutrients. And more importantly, why are these so important? Let's break them down. Let's get right into the weeds.
Gotcha. So macronutrients, when we're talking about them, technically there's four. The fourth is alcohol, so that's not necessarily
I mean, it's
it's
not
not
a
nutrition.
macronutrient of mine.
No, exactly.
I love
It's
it.
referred to as that because it contributes calories, but it also doesn't contribute any nutrients. So I kind of
Mm,
leave that out of most discussions too. We're looking primarily at proteins, carbs, and fats, and they all serve different purposes. So they are all important. And part of that is so protein is kind of like the building blocks of all of our cells. It's not just important for muscle tissue; it's also important for connective tissue, hair, skin, nails, all of the things, as well as organs. Um, And so we definitely need to be consuming that through the diet, especially because there are essential amino acids that our body cannot produce on its own.
So
Similarly,
I was going to say, what does that mean when they're essential? If the body can't produce it, are we talking about that needing to be topped up every single day?
not necessarily. So I try not to. There was kind of like a conversation for a while, especially for people following a plant-based diet, that like you need to be matching up amino acids within a single meal and then definitely within a single day. They do all eventually pool together. So I would say aiming for a wide variety of protein sources throughout a day so that you have a wide variety of amino acids coming in within a 24-hour period is likely a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
But these amino acids basically just have to be consumed through the diet because we cannot produce them. So ideally daily, yes.
Mm-hmm. Got you. Let's talk about carbohydrates, our favorite topic. We also have some questions come in from some of our listeners on social media. I'm going to bring up some of those right now. Let's see what people have been saying and the questions that they're wanting to throw our way, because I feel like carbohydrates, we're still in this era where everybody's kind of still a little bit carb phobic. Would you agree?
I would 100% agree with that, except for you and I probably. We're not carb phobic.
Okay, why? Where is that? Where is this coming from? This anti-carb, zero carb, talk to me about it. What are we dealing with out here as, experts and professionals?
I think this is kind of just one of those pendulum swings, honestly. There was a long period of time where everyone was very anti-fat and everything was low fat, and fat was the bane of our existence. That was the cause of obesity. And now the pendulum has kind of swung over to carbohydrates, and we're making that the culprit of everything, despite the fact that more and more research keeps coming out that that is not the case. It's just, I think we want to blame one thing within the diet for the obesity crisis, these various health epidemics. I think that's mostly where that comes from.
So explain to us the importance of carbohydrates in our diet and its function.
So carbohydrates are technically not essential in the diet, but I'll go into what that means because they are essential for our body. Every part of our body uses carbohydrate as energy. Predominantly the brain. The brain needs 100 grams of carbs per day in order to just meet its basic functional needs.
Wow.
And yeah,
that's
120
interesting
grams.
Because when I find I'm consuming less than 100 odd grams a day of carbohydrate, I get brain fog. I forget things. I know that I'm not functioning on a really high level. And as I increase my carbohydrates, I'm like, I'm going to write an essay. You know what I mean? Keep going. Don't let me interrupt you.
No, that makes perfect sense. And it's one of those things where they're not essential because it's so important to have adequate carbohydrates that our body has developed mechanisms to where it's going to get them one way or another. So carbohydrates are the one macronutrient that we can derive them from proteins and fats through various metabolic processes. And so we can eat exclusively fats and proteins like some people are proposing that we do. And we can then convert those into carbs, but it is a less efficient process. It's kind of the backup mechanism, essentially, because they're so vital that if we don't consume them, we're not going to be around long.
And this typically is what we know to be like the ketogenic diet, right? And so the body's kind of breaking down proteins, so lean muscle mass, and using that as well as fuel. Why is that not necessarily a good idea?
Well, it's kind of the way that I think about it is you can get away with it. You absolutely can. Some people report feeling pretty good, but when we reduce carbohydrates, we also have to think about what we're replacing them with in the diet first and foremost. And for people who don't necessarily require, say, a ketogenic diet, which really emphasizes a very high proportion of fats, we need to also consider the implications that might have. If we're not eating carbs, we're probably missing out on fruits and vegetables. We're probably missing out on fiber. We're probably consuming potentially large amounts of saturated fat, which can impact health negatively too. And so having carbs serves purposes other than just the carbs themselves. And then, especially if you're an active person, those are going to be the immediate source of energy for training, for recovering from training. And so these less efficient processes aren't necessarily going to be as advantageous as just consuming the carbs in their direct form.
Got you. All right, we're going to get into nitty gritty in the weeds. We're going to answer some of the questions that have come in.
All right.
What happens to my body when I'm not eating carbs?
When you're not eating carbs, you're basically going to be breaking down either proteins or fats for carbs, essentially. That process is called gluconeogenesis. And it's essentially the way that our body kind of overcomes the lack of carbohydrate. But again, it's a less efficient process, and we do want those proteins and fats for other purposes as well. And so it's just not as ideal, but again, you can get away with it. I don't want to like scare people away. If they really prefer eating proteins and fats, you can do that. There's just not a strong rationale to do that if you don't need to.
So when you say like, we're pulling, the protein and the fats away from something else, what else can those two macronutrients been serving us in terms of serving our body on a daily basis?
So, if we're specifically, especially talking about females, lipids, so dietary fats, are incredibly important for hormonal health. So, we definitely want to be consuming adequate amounts of those, especially because dietary fats are essential. So, we have essential fatty acids, similar to how we have essential amino acids. We have to consume them in the diet. And so, having adequate reservoirs, essentially, of those is critical for optimal hormonal health. And then same thing kind of goes for protein, especially if we're not eating enough protein on a daily basis. We want to be using that for the processes that our body wants to use it for, and not necessarily broken down into carbohydrates.
Got you. Do I need to eat carbs if I'm trying to lose fat/weight?
So again, you could get away with not eating carbs. However, I do think you're going to be making some sacrifices elsewhere that potentially more than likely aren't worth it. For example, if you're trying to lose weight, if you're trying to lose fat, how you're able to exercise is going to be pretty impactful towards that as well. And if you're on a very low carbohydrate diet, you likely will not be able to perform as well during training. Or recover as well, both of which are going to be really important for weight loss, but specifically fat loss, because most people, when they are pursuing weight loss, don't necessarily want to be losing muscle tissue. They want to be losing body fat. And so having adequate carbs is going to allow you to train harder and maintain that.
We're going to talk about the differences between weight loss and fat loss later, but I'm going to keep going through these because I love a little carb off. Should I change how much carbs I'm eating depending on the days of the week and my activity levels?
So that is something that you can do. It's something that I kind of consider a slightly more advanced option. If you're closely tracking your diet and you know exactly what you're eating on a day-to-day basis and that it's adequate. For example, I like to have higher carb days on days that I go for long runs. That makes a lot of sense because I'm replenishing carbs that are being lost during exercise. I would just also consider the fact that you do want to have adequate carbs on days that you're not training hard as well. It's not like we have to earn them through exercise.
Good point. Are fruits and vegetables carbs?
So typically, yes, in varying amounts. Like, for example, an avocado isn't going to contain much carbohydrate. It's going to contain a larger proportion of fat, and that's technically a fruit. But fruits mostly do contain carbs. Now, that's definitely not a reason to be afraid of fruits. It's the best form of sugar that you can consume, in my opinion. And fiber is also technically a carb, although it's mostly indigestible.
If I don't eat carbs for a while and then I start again, I gain the weight back. Should I stop eating carbs?
No, not necessarily. Because what is likely contributing to the weight gain is not the carbs themselves, but more than likely the calories that they contain. And if you're gaining weight, it does indicate that you're in some form of a caloric surplus. And so you would want to reduce calories if you were gaining weight and not wanting to gain weight, but it doesn't necessarily have to come from carbs. It could also come from dietary fats. I typically suggest a little bit from both if you're trying to enter a caloric deficit.
Okay, we'll talk about those as well later. Can't wait. When is the best time to eat carbs?
So technically speaking, around exercise is going to be when you want them the most, in terms of the way that your body's going to utilize them. It's not that you're going to store them as body fat if you eat them at night or anything like that. What matters most when it comes to the body composition outcomes is going to be your total calorie intake. But pre and post exercise are probably the windows in which I would emphasize them the most.
So one of the things that I've been really encouraging a lot of our clients to do at Slay is to not partake in fasted workouts when their end goal is fat loss. For those clients who are coming in a fasted state, we have the benefit of having an in-body machine over here at the gym. And one of the patterns that I was noticing was a decrease in lean muscle mass. And even just recently, I just spoke to one of my clients about what is she doing on the days before she comes to the gym. And also she plays long rounds of golf. I'm like, are you eating beforehand? She's like, no. I'm like, okay, let's change this little thing. First, let's start with half a banana and see how you feel. Because a lot of the time, sometimes people like to work out on an empty stomach. I'm like, okay, you're going to get about 15 grams of carbohydrates, which is still not going to be enough probably to get you through the session. But just try that, see how you feel. Next week, she maintained her muscle mass. And then we increased it to a full banana. And now she's starting those workouts. She's able to get all the way through, feeling more fuel than she ever has done. And her fat mass having a really positive impact on her fat mass because her lean muscle mass is now being able to, she's not just retaining it, but gaining lean muscle mass again. Just a little story there. I love a little bit of story time. Are all carbs equal, or should we be reaching for certain types?
They are not necessarily equal. However, it's not necessarily because of the carbs themselves that they wouldn't be equal. For example, it's not that like bread is independently worse than a banana, but they're going to contain different nutrients along with the carbs. And so I do think that diversifying your carb sources is important. And especially just because so many people, I think like 95% of the population here in the US doesn't consume enough fiber. Mm-hmm. Seeking out fibrous carbs is going to be important. But if you're struggling to, like, let's say, get in carbs before a workout, a high fiber carb probably isn't your first option. You want something like a banana, for example, with a good amount of readily available sugar. So it kind of depends on the context more than anything.
Love that. What do you use in terms of variety? What are the, like, let's say 3 carbs that you might cycle between in the course of a week? What's constantly in your shopping cart?
My rotation is heavy in potatoes for sure. Mm-hmm. Definitely, I love pasta. I'm never going to not eat pasta. There's probably some form of pasta in most of my days. So that's a big one. I also love rice. So those are probably some of my top 3, like, regular starches. Mm-hmm. But I also consume like a ton of fruit on a regular basis. So that's like a categorical one as well.
Love it. How can you tell if your body responds better to a high carb diet or a low carb diet?
I think the most important consideration, especially if you are seeking results that you want to be able to maintain in the long term, does to some extent boil down to preferences. Now, I always say that with the caveat that you do want to make sure you're getting enough of everything. So you can't restrict fats to nothing. That's going to have negative implications. Go ahead.
Just quickly, I'm going to interject. What would be like the bare minimum in terms of fat? So we have obviously like a protein goal, 1 pound per gram of 1 gram per pound of body weight. But is there an equivalent when it comes to fats?
So there definitely is. I'm trying to think of the exact gram per pound conversion there, but I think this actually might be a little bit more practical too for the people listening. I generally, for females, don't like to bring people lower than about 40 grams is about the minimum that I'll go. Yeah. So I think anything above that, you're going to be safe.
Love that. And final question, do carbs cause water retention?
So they can... Here's the thing. Yes, but not in the form that you were probably asking about, whoever asked this question. We think so. Your weight, for example, after eating carbs can potentially shift up a little bit. Let's say you weigh yourself the next morning after eating a high carb meal or something. Carbohydrates do pull water into the cells. That's part of how they're stored. That's more than likely not subcutaneous, meaning like beneath the skin, which is mostly what we're picturing when we think about water retention. It's actually more similar to like how creatine causes water retention as well, where it pulls water into the muscle cell. If anything, it kind of makes your muscle looks more full.
Mm-hmm. Got you. Um, One of the questions that I wanted to talk about was the difference in goals, weight loss and fat loss, two different things. Explain to us the difference between a weight loss goal and a fat loss goal, and why are we getting these two things confounded? And could women um, understand more about their bodies if they were focusing more on fat loss goals as opposed to weight loss goals?
Absolutely, is the short answer. And essentially, the difference is that when we're thinking about a weight loss goal, that's any form of body weight, right? So that weight can be coming from fat tissue, which is more than likely what most people want, even if they don't necessarily realize that that's what they want. Whereas just overall weight loss can happen also if you're losing muscle tissue, which that's obviously important when it comes to longevity and all the reasons that we've already talked about. But also aesthetically, most people are going to be much happier with how they look if they are losing body fat compared to if they are losing body fat and muscle tissue, for example. Because the muscle tissue is what gives everyone that toned look that we all kind of go for. So it's important to hold on to that.
Mm-hmm. Got you. Love that. We talked obviously in depth about carbohydrates, pre-fueling our workouts. I do want to talk about vegans, our vegans out there. So, one of the questions that always comes up, you have a vegan client, you're a vegan athlete, you are vegan, but you want to get more protein into your diet. How do you go about achieving that?
So it does take a bit more effort. I know this firsthand. Actually, I don't talk about this a ton, but I am primarily vegan. I have been for about 8 years at this point. I also eat eggs, so I don't consider myself fully vegan at this point, but it requires more effort. You just have to be intentional about seeking out protein sources every time you're sitting down for a meal.
Mm-hmm.
B, diversifying those as much as possible so you're not only eating one type of protein over and over again throughout the day. And then I would say C is also, I refer to this as like double dipping. This is not a technical term at all, but when we're kind of thinking about putting together a meal, let's say you're vegan and you really like tofu, that might be your primary protein source in that meal. But let's say as your carb source in that meal, you include beans or
Oof,
chickpeas, something
love.
that is a carb but also contains protein, and so you're kind of double dipping with that. And that can very easily increase the protein content of a single meal without feeling like it is necessarily.
I love that. I've never heard of double dipping. I love the idea of like combining those two dietary proteins together, one obviously being higher in carbs. Now, the interesting thing, working with clients who are vegan that want to transform their bodies, one of the things, and also actually working, one of our former coaches was a vegan bodybuilder. The interesting thing was that the normal rules almost did not apply. And so, where I would say a lot of women, when it comes to calorie deficits, could be in 1,500 calories and in a calorie deficit. Whereas I almost feel like if you like with my vegan clients, making sure that you hit that dietary protein is almost the most important thing when trying to transform or change your body composition. And so one of the things that we found was like diets in excess of like 2,000 calories on a daily basis lend themselves to way more muscle synthesis and muscle building, and then reducing. Once you get to a point whereby, okay, I'm happy with the fact that I'm building lean muscle now, now I can start to kind of reduce perhaps calorie intake while still trying to keep that dietary protein really high. I feel like one of the things that a lot of vegan athletes and people that want to change their body composition are struggling with is the idea of increasing their caloric intake in order to build and gain lean muscle mass.
Yeah,
Have you?
struggling practically or struggling like mentally with that, would you
I would
say?
say mentally. I feel like there's a disconnect that's happening. The idea that, well, if I'm eating over 2,000 calories a day, aren't I just going to get fat? What do you say to those people who are struggling to kind of associate, caloric surplus with lean muscle mass increases? Because often what I see from a body composition perspective amongst our vegans is that there is a real lack of dietary protein, which is causing a real lack of lean muscle mass.
Yeah. So typically, if you're seeking out muscle growth, and that doesn't necessarily have to mean like obviously trying to look like a bodybuilder or anything, but if you want bigger glutes, for example, that is going to weigh something. Glute muscle weighs something, bigger glutes are going to weigh something.
Mm.
And you don't necessarily need to be in an extreme caloric surplus to build muscle tissue, but you do need to be in one. And I see this all the time as well, where even if someone has the goal of building muscle or increasing muscle tone, if that's the terminology that they use, they see the scale increase just by 0.02 and they panic and they don't want to do it anymore. And I think it's just important to always remind people that, hey, if you're going for this specific look, you might weigh more than you expect to, or you might weigh more than you have in the past. And it doesn't mean that you're going to look worse. If anything, usually it ends up being more aesthetically pleasing to you because you have that muscle.
Mm, definitely. So vegans, don't be afraid of being in a calorie surplus, especially if you want to, change that body composition. There's going to be a need for that, and specifically to get adequate dietary protein, right? Let's talk
Absolutely.
about women and our menstrual cycles, and also all of the other hormonal changes that we go through. Do we need to change our diets on our cycles?
No, not necessarily. Most people will experience shifts in appetite throughout their cycle, I would say. And I think that sometimes presents challenges if they're trying to adhere to a caloric deficit, or if they're trying to kind of manage their appetite during, for example, the late luteal phase, for some people, the early follicular phase. So when they're actively bleeding,
Mm-hmm.
they'll be experiencing different sorts of cravings and potentially just a higher appetite in general. And if that's the case, it doesn't necessarily hurt to, I think it's important to honor those cravings within reason. And technically, the data suggests you can potentially be expending like maybe 100, 200 calories more during those phases. So it's likely not going to inhibit your progress as well if you do lean into those cravings a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Love that. Great, because that answers my chocolate cravings. So that's just, honestly, in my mind, I'm like, yeah, that's just what it is. You know what I mean? I think we have to consider what the process is, and the fact that our goals really aren't micro goals, they're macro goals. If we think of our lives as this humongous pie, whether you did or didn't have chocolate during your period is really not going to matter, is it?
No,
What
absolutely
about
not.
we're coaching a lot of women at the moment who are approaching and also potentially going through menopause. What are the things that women who are approaching menopause, going through menopause, can do to lessen the symptoms, to feel better? Those that are dealing with sleepless nights, lots of symptoms happening. What do you recommend?
So I think to the extent that you can, one of the biggest things that I've seen benefit some of the clients that I've worked with, for example, who are kind of in that perimenopause, entering into menopause phase, is prioritizing like strength training and muscle mass and just exercise in general. That can be incredibly regulatory for some of those side effects that are unpleasant at times. Now, I obviously have not been in those shoes. I have not gone through menopause myself, so that's not firsthand experience that I can perfectly speak to. However, I do think that making sure that you are supporting a healthy amount of muscle mass, just healthy exercise behaviors, and also making sure that you have fairly well-rounded and adequate nutrition for in the years going into menopause is also really important, because that also does support a really healthy body composition, which will be carried through that.
Mhm. And then I really want to touch on and just clarify. We've talked obviously about weight loss and fat loss. Now, we talked about weight loss being this general thing. You can get that from loss of water, loss of muscle mass, loss of fat mass. Let's talk about fat loss. And what does that really mean? And how do we go about achieving fat loss?
Yeah, so fat loss is essentially referring to the loss of body fat. Typically, that's either going to be subcutaneous, so kind of beneath the skin, in between the muscle and the skin, or visceral, which is going to be surrounding the organs. That's the type of body fat that is the most promoting of metabolic illness, for example. And so, if we are in a caloric deficit, and if we are strength training and basically continuing to send the stimulus to maintain and potentially build muscle tissue, then that caloric deficit will result in fat loss. Now, if weight loss were the goal, you could achieve that, like you were alluding to, in so many different ways. But losing muscle tissue is not the way that you want to do that. And so, in order to avoid it, you want to make sure you're eating adequate protein and also sending the signal to maintain or build that muscle through strength training.
Talk to me about intermittent fasting, Emily. I saw something online which I may or may not share. It really angered me. It was I'm going to share it, stuff it. A big celebrity this week and a woman who owns a protein company just launched a meal plan of how this particular actress got into shape for a role. And one of the main methodologies that she was shouting about was her 12-hour intermittent fast. Talk to me about intermittent fasting for women. Should we be fasting, or is there another way to go about it?
So there's definitely a lot of ways to go about it. Essentially, the reason intermittent fasting works for people when it comes to weight loss is that you're restricting the window in which you're eating, and that is supportive of a caloric deficit. It's easier to eat fewer calories if you're only eating within a certain time frame. That's why it works. It's not by some other magic mechanism or anything. And more seems to be coming out. And I know you spoke with a couple of other powerhouse female scientists about this in the past, basically suggesting that especially restricting calories in the morning for women is likely not ideal, and especially if you're exercising in the morning. If anything, like cutting off meals a couple of hours before bed might potentially be beneficial and might also help you accomplish that calorie deficit. But you don't necessarily have to restrict the window in which you're eating. It's totally possible to just implement a calorie deficit without having to do that.
I actually want to back up. I said a 12-hour fast. She was actually fasting through to 12 noon, 12 in the afternoon, which means she's probably going to bed at like 8 o'clock. If she's fasting for 12 hours, that means going to bed at midnight, not eating anything, you know what I mean, and then not eating till 12 noon. No, homegirl's going to bed at 8 o'clock, probably shutting down food at 8 o'clock at night, and then fasting through 12 hours. So that's a 16-hour fast. Yes, like I've seen this in practice. It never really works out very well. I feel like actually what it does do is slow the metabolism, encourages undereating, and most definitely is more of a weight loss tactic than a fat loss tactic. This is what I've seen personally. Those people who typically consume breakfast and break fast and fuel their workouts, tend to get there faster. And when I mean faster, what I mean is achieve fat loss as opposed to weight loss faster. So
totally.
It's still just so frustrating that, we're in this day and age, you've got powerhouse women out there still, receiving information, not even receiving information, because I'm not against what anybody chooses to do personally, but when you're spreading that information as the be all and end all and the guideline that every woman should be following, that's where I kind of draw the line, because I'm like, well, having done intermittent fasting and practiced it for myself and not, I remember there was a time where I got immense brain clarity. I was like absolutely firing on all cylinders. I thought, this is amazing. And within about 2 months, I noticed that my lean muscle mass had dropped. I was becoming skinny fat, my muscle tone, my muscle definition. I was lacking energy. I was crashing in the afternoon for my body to recover from that, and also my metabolism to recover. I would say it took my metabolism a good year. And what I mean by that is I had to just work hard to rebuild the lean muscle mass that I'd lost. It was not pretty, and possibly one of the biggest things that I regret doing.
It's really hard to especially get enough protein in. If you're only eating within a very short window of time, that means you're going to be eating like 50, 60 grams of protein in a meal. and nobody really wants to do that. So that's a big one. And I also just don't think it's conducive to living a human life, because most of the time you're going to social events on weekends and you have dinners with loved ones, and you either have to then sacrifice those and miss out on that time, or you then break your whole fasting thing, and then it's obviously not sustainable for the long term.
Yeah. The other thing that I also noticed is that women that are choosing intermittent fasting, especially in their, perimenopause and menopausal stages, end up with a high level of visceral fat. They end up craving, choosing high caloric foods, alcohol consumption goes up. And so they think because they're fasting that they can then eat whatever they like, which then has a negative impact on their overall lifestyle. So the alcohol leads to less poor quality sleep. And the alcohol consumption, along with fatty foods, leads to increased caloric intake during that time. So actually, a lot of the time, seeing it like an actual increase and an actual weight gain and a reduction in quality of lifestyle. That being said, like you said earlier, being very mindful of, potentially having a cutoff time where you're not eating. For me, I find that that's like probably 8 p.m. If anyone's trying to kind of have dinner with me at 9 p.m. at night, I can safely decline that invitation. Like, I don't know
Yeah.
how they do it over in Spain and in Europe, where we're not eating typically until like 10 o'clock at night. Can't do that anymore.
No, me neither.
Emily, is there anything that we haven't touched upon that you were like, you know what, I've been studying this recently, I want the whole world to know about it, that we haven't yet touched upon?
Ooh, I don't know if that's necessarily the case. I unfortunately have been diving into my research right now alone, honestly, so I haven't had as much time to like read other things. Um,
Here's a question
I
for
think
you,
we got a
Emily.
good, yeah.
What do you feel about Ozempic?
Ooh, I think it's something that can be a very valuable tool when used in the right application, but I think most importantly with the correct mindset. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's really important if someone were to pursue that for whatever set of reasons. I think it is really important that they don't necessarily consider that the magic pill or kind of the cure all for what they're struggling with. I think it really should exist alongside intentional behavior change, ideally with either the supervision or the help of someone coaching them, someone helping them with their diets. It needs to be accompanied by strength training, because when rapid weight loss happens, it's very likely that muscle loss can happen if that stimulus isn't present, if there's not adequate protein. And so we kind of have to consider all of those things in order to approach it in a healthy way.
I love that. One of the conversations I was having with the girls in the gym was with, semaglutides being so expensive at the moment. Could we not just funnel that into root cause treatments? So, we know what the struggles are for women with regards to nutrition. We know it's hard to adhere to strict dietary protocols. More importantly, what you're really looking for is to sustain a caloric deficit, and that's what these drugs are providing. We're switching off that kind of that emotional trigger that sometimes causes us to kind of lose our way or perhaps stray from our goals. We totally get it. We understand exactly what the challenges are. But I asked one of the questions in the gym the other day, what if we were able to prescribe diet and nutrition? So what if we were able to prescribe, instead of doctors prescribing injections, what if they were able to prescribe high protein, high fiber meal plans or meal prep that's delivered to your door? What if they were able to provide, prescription to personal training, strength training? Is this potentially, are we kind of jumping the gun? Is my point. Are we going, rather than concern ourselves with root cause for those people who perhaps could make more of an effort in lifestyle changes? Shouldn't we be exploring and exhausting all of those possible lifestyle changes first before we kind of give up and just succumb to the idea of an injection being the answer? An injection that ultimately you have to be on forever.
I definitely agree with that. And again, I completely sympathize with all of the barriers and all of the reasons why people may not be as interested in pursuing all of the different behavior changes that they would have to make in order to kind of achieve the same outcomes. But like we've kind of talked about, previously in this discussion, if we're looking for lifelong change, I do think that beginning with the lifestyle stuff and especially with the correct support, I think if you can work with someone who understands nutrition in the context of your life, you can speed up that process a lot more than you may realize. It's not just the same as doing it on your own, which can be very frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
And also with
And
the help of like someone on the training side.
absolutely. And I also feel that there's that opportunity to just learn so much more about your body, whereas with a medication, as we all know, where especially if you've had, a chronic illness, you don't really learn anything. There's no journey whatsoever. It's just like, okay, I'm taking this and away I go. And so therefore, I think that we can definitely, for those people who are feeling perhaps the pressure to consider it as an option, I would say, root cause first. Look at the things that you potentially could be doing that also have so many other benefits: exercise and nutrition, improving your self-esteem, your overall energy levels, lean muscle mass, longevity, lifespan, all the good stuff. Emily, we're going to finish up with a little game called Slay or Nay. Slay if you're like, yes, all about this, all day, every day. Nay if you're like, no, not me, never, not doing it. Okay, we're starting off easy. We've literally got 10 questions, quick fire, unless they require a little bit more explanation or you want to dive in. Number 1, protein.
Slay.
Number 3, juice cleanses. Number 2, juice cleanses.
Nay.
Why not?
Well, it's essentially just consuming just juice as a cleanse. It's likely not necessarily detoxifying anything. It's just giving your digestive system a little bit of a break, and it's probably containing a ton of sugar and not anything else. Like not anything else as far as proteins and fats are concerned. So I just don't think it's helpful in most cases.
And definitely not a long-term solution, right?
No.
Number 3, weight training.
Slay.
Number 4, walking 10,000 steps per day.
So walking is a slay. Walking that exact amount isn't necessarily the end all be all.
I love that. I thought you were going to, I was like, I'm going to write this because I thought that you were going to be like, it's more nuance to that. I feel like people are attaching their lives to this 10,000 step goal. But you know what? 6,000 steps, 5,000 steps, amazing. I actually I looked on the the internet last week. That's an hour and 40 minutes a day of walking at 3 miles per hour is 10,000 steps. If you were actually going to do that for exercise, that is a lot of time to dedicate. And one of our podcast guests said it's 10,000 movements, not 10,000 steps. And so if you think about, well, there's 2 just there. So there you go.
Exactly.
Number 5, carbohydrates.
Slay.
Slay all day, especially potatoes. Number 6, HIIT training.
Slay when it's accompanied by strength training. It's a great form of cardio.
Love that. 7, chocolate cake.
I'm not a cake person. That's a nay for me.
Oh, what's your treat of choice? If you were going to go
I'm a cookie
sweet
person.
Oh, go on. What's like chocolate chip, plain chocolate chip, double chocolate chip? What are we talking here?
I think I'm gonna lose everyone right now. I'm not a big chocolate person in general, but I really like the fruity desserts. So
Your
like
oatmeal
lemon.
raisin.
I'm oatmeal raisin, like a carrot cake, I will do. But the chocolate isn't really my thing.
If I were to say lemon bar.
Absolutely. That is a slay.
We could share a dessert. I'm actually more like fruity as well, like lemon tart, Anyway, long story short. Number 8, hot yoga.
Slay, but again, just not as the only form of exercise, I think.
Totally get it. It's got its place, isn't it? Number 9, body composition.
Slay. I suppose like a good body composition is a slay.
Good body, even just knowing what your body composition is. I feel like we need to actually shift all of the terminology around body weight, body composition. I think we should just
totally agree.
Completely just get rid of the term body weight. Number 10, body weight.
Body weight. It depends, of course, but I mean, nay, in terms of in favor of body composition.
Love that. I think we should just literally kill the term body weight for good. Emily, thank you so much for coming on. What an absolute treat and an absolute pleasure. When are you planning on finishing your doctorate?
Oh, fingers crossed, like end of March, early April is
So
the
March
goal.
2025, April.
Yes.
Amazing. Well, do you have any plans to come to Los Angeles? Maybe we can catch you after that.
Possibly. I mean, I have a couple friends out there. I love going to California, so if I ever do, I'll definitely reach out. I'm sure
Amazing.
I'll go within the year, so at some point.
Brilliant. You have to come and visit us here at Slay. Emily, thank you so, so much for joining us. Let everybody know, where can they find you? I know that you have coaching programs, and like, give us all the details.
Yeah, so my Instagram is really the only place that I'm active right now. So my username is at nutritional.gangster. That's the easiest way to find me. I do work with people on a one-on-one basis. I have a relatively limited roster, but there are spots available because I just don't want to overextend myself while I'm finishing this PhD because I give my clients a lot of time and attention. But I work with folks on the nutrition side. I work with them on the coaching side when it comes to lifting. So I have all of that. All of that is available.
I love that. Thank you ever so much for joining us, and can't wait to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor.
That concludes this episode of Slay. Stay tuned for more empowering discussions on female health, fitness, and life. You can follow me, Louise Hazel, on social media, and you can follow Emily at nutritional.gangster right now. You can also check out the Slay brand at Slay Athletic, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already on YouTube, and leave us a comment. You can also get fit at home using our Slay app. You can download that now for free from the App Store to join our online community.